This is the third lecture. Notice how if we say 3, we imagine a structure in our minds. If I hold up 3 fingers, you see the image. The mind makes a structure before it makes an image. Until it's trained in structure, it doesn't make images. But the eye makes images right away. And we would think that the mind records those images right away, and it does not. In meditation or in contemporary physiological science, we know that the images are not conveyed to the mind. If you look into the eye of someone, you can see yourself in the pupil of their eye, and you see your own image in their eye, and you think that that image is in their mind. It is not. For between the eye and the mind are electrical impulses, neurophysiological impulses, so that the mind must decode an alphabet of impulses, and it must be very trained in order to see images. And if the mind is not trained, if the structure is not there, the mind does not see, even though the images are before it, and one would think this is obvious. And so our minds are trained to see form. And depending on the culture in which we are raised, we are taught to pick out certain forms and prefer them. In no cultures, in a natural sense, is anyone ever taught to see what is not there. And so the Tao is invisible. It does not occur in the eye, but curiously enough, it occurs in the mind, naturally. So that in disciplining ourselves to see images in this world, we impair the natural quality of the mind to see the Tao. Now in meditation, you can train yourself to introvert the sense of perception. And when you interiorize perception and train yourself, what you learn to see are not things, not images at all, but wholeness. One thing. The totality, allness. And one can see this. And so the mind is naturally in the Tao all the time. But training ourselves in human culture lead us away from this. The first lecture we talked about the Tao, and last week we talked about the Te. And we saw how they align themselves in a very mysterious way. The Tao as a zero base, and the Te as the oneness that occurs. So that in a very deep meditation, when you see interiorly, one sees Te. You see the oneness of Te. But when you let go of the discipline of seeing inwardly, you see nothing but what occurs as the Tao. This is a very curious happening in higher spiritual endeavors. This letting go of the discipline on the very high level of being able to see the oneness so that the Tao occurs is what is called in Chinese Wu Wei. No effort. Whereas the way by itself, that which is named the way, the Tao, is actually the discipline in order to see the Te, the oneness. Because the zero and the oneness, because the Tao and the Te occur always together, the one displacing the other instantaneously. They are the root of the yin-yang, with the Te being the yang and the Tao being the yin. In the third of the 5-phase energy cycle, it is we, the observers, it is I who experiences both the letting go and letting the zero occur, or the oneness through my discipline. It is I, the observer, who balance both, and thus the third phase of the energy cycle is human heartedness, in Chinese called Zhen. And it has a value of 2, even though it's the third phase. And what it means is that we can, in a balance, in equilibrium, have the Tao and the Te together, perfectly balanced. In that condition of equanimity, man is the bridge between heaven and earth. When, again, out of that balance, a dynamic ensues, where the balance is still there theoretically, but because it's in motion, it's a dynamic balance. That dynamic balance generates an energy, like an electromagnetic energy. And in the resonant waveforms of that energy, shapes of tension occur. The most powerful of those shapes are the symbols in the mind. And it is those symbols in the mind that in Taoism are called the I, just plain I. I. So we have 4 phases. We have Tao, which cannot be numbered, 0 is the designation. We have the Te in the second place, whose designation could be 1. We have in the third place Zhen, human heartedness, whose designation would be 2. And then the fourth place, designation 3, is this I. That I, because it has efficacy of vibrating with the Te, the fourth and the second places correspond together, so that the symbols in the mind have the power to make things happen. And where do they make things happen? They make things happen in this world. And so the symbolic power of mind creates the ordering of this world. In Taoism, that's called Li, or principle. And so the 5th phase, given a designation of 4, is that we make this world into an order on the basis of what we see in our minds, and what we make, if it is consonant with the whole energy cycle in harmony, will be natural. what we make will fit in with nature. Just as a woven basket has natural grasses woven into a shape to make a basket, indeed, but the basket is natural. It's as natural for grasses to grow out of the ground. It's just as natural for grasses to be woven into a basket. There's nothing artificial about that grass basket. To the Taoist, it's very important that human culture preserve the gem in order that the power of the symbols in the mind will make a civilization in the fifth phase that will correspond with the gem, the human heartedness, and be able to flow back into the Tao without leaving a trace. Now this five-phase energy cycle, five-phase Tao Te, I have put into the Spiritual Personality pamphlet, which most of you have from the Saturday, and I'll run off some other copies. It's on page 9. This five-phase energy cycle was intuited in ancient times, but the first person to ever express it was Lao Tzu, and this was about 550 BC, about 2,450 years ago, 2,540 years ago. It did not register at first. One finds that within a century of Lao Tzu, nothing that he said on a very deep level registered. Confucius, who was one of the most sensitive of the younger generation coming up at the time when Lao Tzu was old, said, "Who can talk with the dragon?" In other words, someone like Confucius could not hear what Lao Tzu said. But what impressed Confucius was what he was able to hear. And so Confucian thought starts from the point at which they could hear. They couldn't hear about the Tao, and they couldn't hear about the Te, but they could hear about the Gen, about human heartedness. So Confucianism begins with the Gen, with the third phase, unknowing about the first two phases at all, assuming that the first two phases, which they did not know about, are givens, and that they could not be, it would have surprised them, that they were distinct enough in a very arcane way, mysteriously, to be recognized for what they are and for what they are not. The English translation of the Confucian term for Gen is benevolence. That's the standard translation. Benevolence in that it presupposes that when our heart is whole, we will be kind and good and generous, benevolent. The E and the Li are also preserved in Confucian thought. So the third, the fourth, and the fifth phases are the beginnings of the Confucian thought. There is Gen, which is benevolence, there is E, which is righteousness, and there is Li, which is law, or principle. A couple hundred years after Lao Tzu, people began, very rare, but some people began to hear what Lao Tzu had said. And that over and over again, the five-phase energy cycle form of change occurred in a Confucian mode, because they had not been able to hear Lao Tzu originally. The Confucian tone became predominant, and about 350 to about 300 BC, which would have been about 200 years after Confucius, about 200 years, maybe 250 years after the Tao Te Ching was written, as distant from us as would be the mystical poems of John Donne. This whole quality of Confucian thought made then of the five-phase energy cycle that its initial phase must be Zhen, benevolence. Its second phase must be Li, righteousness. Its third phase must be Li, which is propriety. And then they added the two other phases, which they call wisdom and good faith, which are kind of like psychological makeups for the Tao and the Te. But somehow wisdom and good faith were also important in this. So that if you go, after several thousand years of this kind of Confucian bias, to what was originally in the Tao Te Ching, in a very pure form, quite distinct, the Confucian bias after 2,000 years registers itself, so that when you come to a history of Chinese philosophy by Feng Yuan, written in 1930s in China, published by Princeton University Press in the 1950s, you will find in Volume 1, on page 27, at the bottom, when the man Feng Yuan is talking about the 5 elements which correspond to the 5-phase energy cycle, he lists them as Wu Chang. These are the Confucian virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and good faith. Now, someone who is a major professor, Feng Yuan was the greatest of all the Chinese professional philosophers of the early 20th century. One would think that he should certainly know. And almost nobody in academia would ever suppose to catch up Feng Yuan and hold him up for this. Hold him up for the errors of this. But actually Feng Yuan was publicly held up to ridicule for being an academic misleading the people by Zhou Enlai, who was a real Taoist. Even more than a communist, he was a Taoist. And Zhou Enlai had Feng Yuan recant his Confucian misleading academic flaws publicly in Beijing in the 1960s. And at that time, the Western press that did pick it up as a minor story said how humiliating to take this old professor and hold him up to this kind of public ridicule. But actually, someone like Zhou Enlai, who you must understand was quite intelligent enough to be behind the scenes of Mao for decades and decades, and after he died, changed China exactly the way that he saw it, leaving almost no trace of Maoism within a couple of years. It takes a first-class genius to do that. His model for that, incidentally, was Taizong, the founder of the Tang Dynasty, who allowed for other people to be the front man for many years, and then when the time came, Taizong just simply re-established Taoist China. And just as the Tang Dynasty was a great age, perhaps the greatest golden age of China, so too Zhou Enlai envisioned a great age for a new Taoist China. Now Taizong, whose Chinese name was Li Shimin, was of the Li family, and Lao Tzu's name was Li and so Taizong considered himself a member, a distant ancestor of Lao Tzu. In fact, later on, the grandson of Li Shimin, who became the Emperor Ming Huang, Ming meaning the brilliant, Huang or Shuang, was the greatest, he was the Lorenzo de Medici of the Tang Dynasty, the greatest cultural sponsor. He favored the poet Li Po because Li Po was of the Li family, and he considered him a distant relative of Lao Tzu and of the founder of the Tang Dynasty, his grandfather, Li Shimin. Li Po had blue eyes. He was a Chinese with blue eyes. He was born in what used to be far the reaches of Persia, not at all in what we would normally think of as China. And the rationale in the Tang Dynasty was that Lao Tzu had rode west, giving up the court life. He was the historian, the royal historian. He had access to all of the books, all of the records for all time in China. And when he was tired of the court and of the world, he rode west through the Hankou Pass, where the keeper Yin Shi beseeched him to leave something for future generations, and what he left were the 5,000 characters of the Tao Te Ching, and then left, and because he was nearly an immortal, he kept going west and ended up in the far west. And so the family of Li Po, who had blue eyes, were of this ancient Taoist lineage. Very curious. In the early 1960s, when I was first in San Francisco, there used to be an old Chinese man who wore a large charcoal gray coat and a charcoal gray hat pulled down, who used to go into the Kwangming Taoist Society, a little alley off Waverly Place there. And he also had blue eyes and very pale skin. And it was incredible to see a Chinese face with such pale skin and blue eyes, piercingly blue eyes, not so much in the way they looked at you, but the way in which, when they looked up, they looked with complete openness. This quality in Taoism is lost by the academics of all ages. Someone like Feng Yuan, completely insensitive to this. It takes cultivation to be able to even appreciate this. It takes long discipline in letting oneness occur and then letting go of it and letting spontaneously nothing occur, in order to really appreciate that this actually has great efficacy in this world of time-space. When it comes then to understanding the five-phase energy cycle, which is indispensable for understanding the Tao Te Ching, and now we're going to come back to our own time and see how popularly the Tao is completely misunderstood. And even academically, on some of the highest levels, it's misunderstood. And what is even worse, that psychologically, on the highest levels, it was not understood. I have here a little something. It's a Xerox from a new book that's making its way around. Feminine fusion, the power to transform strength with sensitivity, logic with intuition, and sexuality with spirituality, by a woman who is obviously intelligent and fashionable and publishable. I don't wish to reveal her name right now, and I don't wish to belittle her, but just to use this as a typical example of a very intelligent and sensitive person in our time who's completely misled, doesn't understand anything about them at all. She writes, in a word to the reader, we must now look deeper than just the reality of form, which she calls, in parenthesis, the masculine energy, in order to find ourselves anew. Our educational, social, and planetary systems have become too sluggish and stagnant to propel us onto the next evolutionary plateau. And you recognize this is the kind of language spoken a great deal now, currently. We need desperately, she writes, to quicken our understanding of the laws of energy so that we can penetrate the seemingly insurmountable problems we face and bask in the peace of solutions. These unknowns are likely to defy all our technological prowess because they have been placed squarely in the path by our very souls in order to awaken an octave of reality more complex than just the planes of matter. In short, the next evolutionary ladder is quite uncompromisingly that of the spirit, and this is the feminine energy. This is a very serious misunderstanding of masculine and feminine. It is a real impairment of understanding energy in its transformational phases. But she goes on and compounds the error here. The way of the masculine or yang energy, notice the Taoist term, the way of the masculine or yang energy simply cannot take us up to new levels of existence, because the natural flow of the masculine moves outward to structure, not inward to knowing as does the feminine. And she goes on in this way, and finally concludes, it is the metaphor of energy flowing back to its source. Feminine energies describe very inward faculties such as intuition, empathy, encompassing spirituality. Masculine or yang energies are those forces that extend outward, manifesting rational, linear, protecting. Thus, yang energy moves out to form manifestation, and yin energy circles more inward to essence. And it's completely extraneous to Taoism, to the Tao Te Ching, to understanding the real, as we might say. No blame. She is simply voicing the current product, which is like an end result of almost accidental bumpings of ideas. And she does her best, and her rhetoric is very honest, because she records what is absolutely mediocre and centered. The responsibility for this mediocrity lies with those at the beginning of this century who should have known better. First person to hold up to a little public ridicule, with your permission, someone that I admire very much, and whose writings I admire extremely, and whose books I have used for at least 30 or 35 years to great advantage. But there are flaws, deep flaws in his understanding. The man is Richard Wilhelm, whose translation of the I Ching is the standard for the English-speaking world, having sold almost 5 million copies. So that most of the understanding about the I Ching Book of Changes, is based on his work, his translation. His translation into the German, and fortunately, Wilhelm did not translate the German into English. Wilhelm's German was translated into English by a woman. Her name was Baines. She was married at the time to H.G. Baines. And this woman, in her own capacity, rectified and reconstructed some of Wilhelm's prejudices with some of her own, and in a remarkable way, the I Ching that comes to us, the Wilhelm Baines translation, is fairly trustworthy and fairly accurate. If one wished to understand the Tao, one needs to go to a different locale than Wilhelm's own writing. This is his translation of the Tao Te Ching, and of course it caused great joy when the Richard Wilhelm edition came out in English, published in 1985 in this edition. Here's how he writes in his introduction, in his commentary rather, on the teachings of Lao Tzu. Life, in its highest manifestation, appears in the form of an individual personality. But the personality is, in a manner of speaking, only the vessel whose content is Tao. And that's not all right. There are many things wrong with that statement. But what is really more serious is that there's something impaired in the mind that would make language form that statement. That's more serious. For rhetoric can be corrected by sophistic education. You can teach one to speak correctly. But the impairments of a mind need to be self-corrected. No one can teach that. And if you cannot do that for yourself, no one else can do that for you either. He goes on to write of this vessel whose content is Tao. We are a box that has something in it. Notice that the inference is that the Tao is a something contained by us. In the early 20th century, when Wilhelm was doing this work, this was a prejudice in the German language mind. It leads to some very serious misunderstandings of spirituality, as those who fought against the Third Reich can well attest. Wilhelm goes on to write about Tao. It wants nothing for itself. Notice the it as a reference to something. It wants nothing for itself. It does not even know itself. Notice now the subtle prizing of not knowing in an ignorant, a sophisticated, ignorant way. Of being subtly proud that one is ignorant. This had a great appeal in the Germany of the 1930s. We are free and we will have our liberation because as a people we're glad to be ignorant of these things, which cannot be known. He goes on, Wilhelm goes on, about Tao. It does not act, has no goals and no designs, and just because of this it lives. And just because of this it lives. That it has no goals, no designs, and you can see in our own generation a kind of a neo-Third Reichian quality in the punk generations. Very similar. Very similar in outlook to the Confucians of the Han Dynasty, the Roman Chinese, who burned all the books and kept just those few that they were going to use for state exams. Wilhelm goes goes on to write, as soon as this unconsciousness is sullied or spoiled, the gradual downward path begins. So not only is unconsciousness equated with Tao, finally, and yet subtly given substance, it has to be left alone and not sullied, not spoiled by introspection, by a critical mind. You can see that this is not only humanly, but politically a very dangerous situation. It was so in China, it was so in Germany, and it is so in the contemporary world today. There's a much more explosive nitroglycerin from the debunked rhetoric of communism. This rhetoric is undetected so far, and unrespected by any critical balance. The first step, writes Wilhelm, is toward love of one's fellow man, as yet with no goals or designs, not wanting anything, but nevertheless acting and being effective. The next step is towards justice, which means acting upon the principle and with goals and designs. The final step is morality. Here one acts, and if no one responds, one waves one's arms about and resorts to force in order to subject men to a system of morality. Men too correspond to these levels. The lowest among men hardly know that the highest exists. The next ones down, they love. The next ones further down, they fear, and the next ones down from them they despise. Life, however, has no need to hanker after recognition. Life has no need for recognition. The highest human life has no need to remember anything. All in the name of Tao, but this is in the name of a pre-structured mental idea about Tao and not Tao. Let's take something a little more insidious. Let's leave Richard Wilhelm for a while. Let's stay in the German language mind of the early 20th century. Let's go to Carl Jung. You almost never find any criticism in Jung. Well, brace yourself. In the collected letters of Jung, published in 2 volumes of Princeton, the Bollingen series, letters 1906 to 1950, you can find, and I must say to you, I love Uncle Carl. I've been reading Jung since 1956, and I rather like a lot that he writes. But we live in a very dangerous space between ages, and one has to be as wise as serpents and gentle as doves to make it through. Here's a letter that he wrote on the 8th of June 1942 to another psychiatrist, a man named Nutt, B. Nutt. Dear colleague, and then he goes on to talk about scholasticism and Aristotelianism, Neoplatonic and Neo-Pythagorean, the quintessence of the Hermetic philosophy as a classical feeling for nature and as pagan par excellence. This lumen naturae was bound to appear obnoxious to the Church, for which reason the philosophic tendency in alchemy did not visibly break through until about the 14th century. The parallel development in China is instructive in that alchemy was there allied with Taoism, and in the first centuries after Christ was pressed back by Confucianism along with Taoism and its ancient sources. But in keeping with the greater tolerance in China, alchemy resumed its philosophical flights, perhaps by the 8th century, and put forth blossoms such as The Secret of the Golden Flower, which Richard Wilhelm brought out with my collaboration, 1926. Confucianism could, in a sense, be compared with the Aristotelianism of the Church. The symbol-laden obscurantism of our medieval alchemy, which strikes us as almost pathological, was due not least to the necessity of disguising the paganism of the alchemist's views, because of the mortal danger of falling foul of the Holy Inquisition. Since the essential source of knowledge in Hermetic philosophy was the lumen naturae, or individual revelation. And incidentally, it is not on the individual level lumen naturae, it is lumen te lumen. It is light within light in the Hermetic tradition. It is altogether understandable that the revelation administered by the Church could not tolerate a second revelation. Consequently, those deep springs bubbling up from nature, i.e., from the depths of the psyche, were largely blocked, and the psychic component of our cognitive processes was excluded from the purview of consciousness. Now, this is clinically very accurate and very right. What it means is that the Western mind, classically also, blocking the Tao and the Te out, began with man and went on to the power of his mind to make symbols, to change the world, and that there was something that we really couldn't be conscious of, really couldn't name, and it must be divine, and we really can't tell about it. And somehow the East and the West have ended up in the very same kind of situation, except for this very interesting statement here by Jung, 1942. Jung was born in 1875, so that Jung was 67 years old. He's not a young, inexperienced man at all. As I've had the good fortune to go more closely into the psychology of Orientals, it has become clear to me that anything like a question of the unconscious, a quite notorious one for us, simply doesn't exist for these people. So that the universal idea of the unconscious does not exist in 1/4 of the human race. How interesting. How empirically fascinating. What kind of a universal psychology would this be? Why would someone like you not see the unconscious in the Chinese, not just in some Chinese, but in analysis in the Orientals, in the Far East, Japanese as well as Chinese? In the case of the Indians, he means many Indians and also some American Indians. For instance, it is overwhelmingly clear that their whole spiritual attitude is based on what with us is profoundly unconscious. It was therefore left to psychopathology in the 20th century, rather than, say, theology, to discover that a quite substantial portion of our psyche has disappeared and has become unconscious. And indeed, a great portion of the Western psyche is unconscious and not available for remembrance, not available for inspection empirically, and not available for recognition. But the Eastern mind also has the same, if not a similar, condition. So that it's very difficult to meet anyone with a Chinese language mind who could read the Tao Te Ching and have the Tao occur to them in what we would say in our best rhetoric with its pristine exactness. And so translations and commentaries proliferate on the Tao Te Ching, and almost all of them are totally misleading. The best writer alive. Taoism in English with a Chinese background is Master Nipa Ching. And yet if one looks very closely, there are many interesting little triggers in his writings. One of the correspondences is that among the planets, Mars is said to correspond with fire, and yet in ancient Taoism it was the planet Mercury that corresponded with fire. There are many little areas of indication that would permit us to be a little more circumspect. Let's come back to Jung for just a second, because this is important. Let's come to Psychological Types, Volume 6. Now, we're not losing track of talking about the 5-phase energy cycle, but we're reminding ourselves in the best sustained, calm way possible that we need to be circumspect about our understanding. So I'm doing this so that you can appreciate, that's the correct word, so that you can appreciate how difficult it is to really understand Lao Tzu. It is really rare, it is really subtle. It's not enough to have an academic background. You can be Harvard trained. It won't make any difference at all. But that doesn't mean that intellectual training is then invalid. One has to go into a more ample quality of education. Where's that more ample quality of education? In nature. That's why I liken the Saturday from the very beginning of nature. Because the Chinese, Lao Tzu, the Taoists, all began in nature. We have a common starting place. The first emendation, though, to mark is that nature is not things. If anything, nature is an ecology of processes. And it is the total pattern, the total cycle of that ecology of patterns. Those patterns of process, like think of energy waves going out from many different sources, and where the energy waves overlap, things come into existence there. Where the energies of time and space overlap, there can be materiality there. In the electromagnetic spectrum of energy, that whole wide spectrum, from infrared to ultraviolet, only in one little infinitesimal range can there be visual images that the eye could record. Visual light is like a little tiny chink in this enormous dial of electromagnetic energy. And the human eye is made physiologically to record exactly that little chink of visible light and resolve material form to the point where we could see who it is that we are seeing. You could see a human personality. And if you can recognize an individual human personality visually, you can understand the Tao. Because the Te that makes someone who they are is the oneness. And that there is a grace, that's the religious term, that there is a grace that allows us to occur, that's the Tao. Anyone can understand that, even children can understand that. That we accept the grace and the oneness of the person equally, that's the gem. That's the human heartedness. And that we can, in our mind, symbolize that meaning for us of what that means, that we can see someone for real, who they really are, and have the grace to accept the Tao that lets them occur, that they really are, and balance that within ourselves. That's the Ching. That's the Taoist Ching. And yes, it is important, but it is a great act of throwing out the Tao and the Te to just begin there at Jen, because if you begin there, the Jen becomes subtly something egotistical. And instead of human-hearted in terms of nature, one becomes human-hearted in terms of man. And very often our experience in this world is that in order to be human-hearted in terms of man, we have to be watching out for ourselves against the other guy, against all oncomers. And this becomes inculcated into cultures over the millennium, and the whole sense of egotistical identity becomes a mask which is never even questioned. Never even questioned. And for someone to say that this occurs a long way down the ladder of reality, people say, well, this is just metaphysical speculation, isn't it? You don't really know. But in the Tao Te Ching, as we will see, there are people who really know. Can be known, can be recognized, can be remembered, can be expressed with accurate dynamic language, and can be lived quite adequately. Let's come back to Jung, though. Let's not let Uncle Carl off the hook. Because he's one of the best. Because he should have known better. Because when even one of the best mislead the millions, the damage is even more serious than if it were some kind of easily recognizable tyrannical dictator. This is why the spiritual principles always, those who can affect the spiritual realm must count themselves out if they can't live it completely. Because only the life lived is the doctrine really received. That's why the highest teachers like, say, Socrates or Jesus or Lao Tzu are those who simply live it. In Psychological Types, which is one of Jung's first great books, written in the early 1920s, he is going through the type problem, that is to say, the psychology of types, about the historical background of dividing human personality into various types. And here's the type problem in poetry, and really the beginning of this whole development in Jung is due to the German language poet Schiller, or it's Schiller's genius that came up with the typology that Jung uses, without the Kantian overtones that Jung assumes in it. And one could, with great profit, go back to Schiller's original, which almost nobody does. Schiller's original becomes a very great statement, not only in the Ode to Joy, the poem that Beethoven used for the Ninth Symphony, but also in his book on the aesthetic education of man, which we will use in the Saturday class next year in more sophisticated time for us. By page 214 in Psychological Types of the Collected Works, Volume 6, we come to Section D, the uniting symbol in Chinese philosophy. The uniting symbol in Chinese philosophy. Jung writes, the idea of a middle way between opposites is to be found also in China, in the form of Tao. It's italicized here, not capitalized. In the form of Tao, the idea of a middle way between the opposites is to be found in China in the form of Tao. Now, the form of Tao is Te, not Tao. And the idea of Tao would be in the fourth phase in E. Symbolic idea. If you don't understand the five-phase energy cycle, even someone as sophisticated as Carl Jung botches it badly, to be polite. Misunderstands in 90 different ways. And instead of getting the jewel of Lao Tzu, you get some kind of finger painting refraction of what a diamond looks like to a monkey. And you say, geez, how brilliant. Look at this finger painting. No, experience the jewel. It's different. It's possible. We've only gone one sentence into it. It's really embarrassing, I must say. It's embarrassing to see that this is used as the, for many people, as the common understanding of non-Western thought. The concept of Tao is usually associated with the name of the philosopher Lao Tzu, born 604 BC, but this concept is older than the philosophy of Lao Tzu. It is bound up with the ancient folk religion of Taoism. Ancient folk religion of Taoism. We will learn a little bit later that Taoism as a religion comes into play in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. There's no such thing as Taoist religion before that. At all. Not at all. A concept corresponding to the Vedic RTA, Ruta. The meaning of, and he has gone into Brahman and Brahmanism and Rita here, the equivalents, makes an equivalent of Mitra and Brahman in the earlier passage here. The meaning of Tao, the meanings, plural, of Tao are as follows: way, method, principle, natural force or life force, the regulated processes of nature, the idea of the world, the prime cause of all phenomena. Wait a minute. There's no causality whatsoever in Tao. There are correspondences, but there is no causality. The idea is in the 4th phase, which is a long ways and not even resonant with Tao, the 0 phase. To talk about the idea of Tao is already to be not only off the fairway, but off the golf course and out of town. Pardon me, I get excited sometimes. This is Jung. This is not just anybody. This is really somebody special. And now there are people that don't even read Jung. They read people who have read Jung and then write their own summary, and then those people say, oh yeah, well Jung says. And then people consider themselves educated because they've heard about those people who knew about somebody who wrote about what Jung says, who somebody read Jung, and then Jung himself. I mean, it's embarrassing. Someone who is really wise in this age is almost beside themselves to even say anything. It's that bad. The prime cause of all phenomena, the right, the good, the moral order. Now Tao, not the moral order at all. Righteousness, 4th phase, would be the moral order. And the principles which are worked out of that Li are in the 5th phase. Now if you remember the talk in last week about Te, If you get the 5-phase energy cycle wrong, it doesn't have its ecological flow. The 5th phase doesn't go back into Tao, but there's a tendency to have a 6th phase, which is always disorder. Always disorder. If the Tao is left out of consideration, even though it's zero-based, and even if you had the oneness, you would still be making a 6th phase try to happen, which means that you're making disorder happen by design. And we'll see that all human religious concepts of God as oneness create disorder automatically in the way in which reality unfolds itself. As soon as you have some substantial idea of the oneness of God as good, you have disorder immediately, spontaneously. And the more that you try to balance those two, the more that you go out of phase and get forced into a mental idea of yourself rather than the human-hearted, the Gen. You get forced into a symbolic balancing act. This is very exhausting in terms of physical energy. And people finally just get tired and give up and let someone else tell them what to do. And this, of course, is what Romans and Confucians and other tyrannical governmental forms love. To have a population who are very docile and will do what they're told, because they don't have any ideas of their own, and they don't have any confidence that anybody else could, and no one knows what to do anyway, and there probably isn't anything to do in this universe anyway. And so you can see that ignorance gets laid upon ignorance until it is miles deep. Fortunately, ignorance is an out-of-phase truth. And as soon as truth comes back into focus, untruth no longer occurs. As the Buddha would say, in enlightenment, there's not any memory of samsara whatsoever. It doesn't leave any trace whatsoever. It's not like a wisp of smoke or a memory that it was there. It no longer occurs at all. It never did occur, really. And so it's called illusion or samsara. It's only illusion that this is happening. But the real is not occurring. That the Tao is not cycling in the ecology pristinely, effortlessly, spontaneously, leaving no trace whatsoever. So this is a very interesting psychological statement. When Jung then comes into play, he writes, I have a note here to look at the footnote on page 105, which I think here it is. It seems to me, since Tao, like Rita, then has a tinge of substantiality. And here in Jung is the clear statement, the way by which metaphysical astral plane illusion comes to be accepted, that the Tao has a tinge, just a slight tinge of substantiality. This is a very serious error. This is 6th phase illusion at its best. It's the source of all astral projection speculation. And incidentally, Jung is just echoing this misunderstanding that has happened world round for a long time. It is a characteristic of scene. He writes here in paragraph 362 on page 215, just across the page, knowledge of Tao, therefore, has the same redeeming and uplifting effect as the knowledge of Brahman. Man becomes one with Tao, the unending durée créatrice, if we may use the concept of Bergson. For Tao is also the stream of time. It is irrational, inconceivable, and then he gives a little quotation. It is obviously an irrational union of opposites. And notice here what Hume is saying, Tao is irrational. Well, that's right. If you're out of phase, if you're not in the 5-phase energy cycle, and you're trying to create the 6th phase, that's what's irrational. Not that the Tao is irrational. There's no such thing as irrationality in Taoism. Later on, like in Chuang-Tzu, who lived in the 3rd century BC, when all of these correspondences, yin-yang, the 5 elements, were being put into correspondences with the 5-phase energy cycle, it was rather humorous. And Chuang-Tzu is a real first-class wisdom humorist. How strange and funny it is that people will do these kinds of very strange contortions, and it has absolutely no bearing on spirituality. Like Chuang-Tzu criticizes those who imitate the movements of birds and the various other things, that is to say Tai Chi movements, who think then that they're becoming very spiritual. Is absolutely absurd. It was observed 2,300 years ago. It's pathetic now. You only need to be 19 years old to have fluid body movements. That's hardly anything at all. This union, irrational union of opposites, this phrase of Hume's, this is very telling. The irrational union of opposites, that the Tao, notice that the Tao now is unconscious. It is the unconscious. It's not even participating. He says later on that in this way, being unconscious, the Tao is the creative process. So creativity is creative because it's unconscious. And what is held up then is the human being in the state of infancy is really a prize. So we have to be blanked out like infants. And then we could have creativity, but then we would be participating in this irrational union of opposites. All of this sounds very strange to come from someone like Carl Jung. And indeed, when he wrote this in 1921, the psychology of psychological types, none of this was apparent. 5 years later, the National Socialist Party would be founded in a beer hall. And 7 years later, it would take over the entire country. And people would say, how could this happen? Well, the roots and the preparation were very complete. There is no way that the Chinese can criticize this, because this is exactly what happened in China also. This is what happened by the Confucian order coming in to dominate the Chinese mind. And when it finally won the day by the establishment of the Han Dynasty, about 221 BC, it simply X'd out all competition and reduced all learning to a ritual pattern, which was followed without exception all the way until the 20th century. In the midst of all this, we have to understand that this 5-phase energy cycle in the classic Chinese understanding is characterized by correspondences. The first, which is a 0 base, is resonant with the 3, which is where we are, the 3rd phase. And the Zhen and the Dao then correspond. And in the same way, the Te, the 2nd, and the 4th, the E, correspond. But the Zhen also corresponds with the 5th phase. So where we are, because our essential thusness is a balance, we correspond with 2 different and yet harmonious qualities, 0 and the 4, which is the 5th phase, with the Tao and the Li. So the Chinese way of saying this, in a pithy little saying, is that man is the bridge between heaven and earth. Not heaven in the sense of Tian, up there, but heaven and the early Chinese in the sense of Tao. Now in the 300s BC, Chinese have 28 constellations, but the Chinese astrological sense was becoming formed along the line of these correspondences, and in ancient times had been used as a form of divination, and now it was going to be turned slowly into a form of state empire building authoritarian control. A very serious issue at that time. The genius who tried to figure out all of the ways in which yin and yang folded into the 5-phase energy cycle, so that each of the correspondences to the 5-phase energy cycle, the 5 elements, for instance, earth, wood, metal, fire, and water. In the ancient Chinese, it was always earth first. Always wood in the 2nd place, always metal in the 3rd, always fire in the 4th, always water in the 5th. All this will be changed in Chinese history so that when it comes down to contemporary times, it is completely botched, so that in contemporary times, the beginning is with water, and then it moves to fire, then it moves to wood, then it moves to metal, and then it ends up with earth. And you'll find in Master Ni's book, and most Chinese correspondence books by so-called experts, East and West, this kind of correspondence is just completely extraneous to the Tao Te Ching, completely extraneous to the Tao. The man who set up these correspondences, or who formed them first, his name was Tsuyan, T-S-O-U-Y-E-N, Tsuyan. Tsuyan is a contemporary, roughly, of someone like Alexander the Great, only he lived to be around 70 instead of dying in his 30s. He lived roughly from 350 BC to about 270 BC. Zhuyan was the most famous man of his day. He's a contemporary, late contemporary of Chuangzi and Mencius. They're all about the same time. When Zhuyan made the correspondence of these 5 elements, that these 5 elements always occur in this phase cycle, because the 5-phase energy cycle occurs in this way. So that Earth as an element corresponds to Tao, that wood as an element corresponds to Te, metal as an element corresponds to Jen. Let's pause there for a second. Metal corresponds to Jen, so that the processes that apply to metal also apply to us. So that the alchemical processes of working with metal also have a correspondence with the inner alchemy of us. So that about 340, 330 BC, for the very first time in China, you get the beginnings of alchemy in Taoism because of the five-phase energy cycle and the correspondences. But the most important factor to put into this, and Su Yin spent years at this. He wrote over 100,000 Chinese characters, it's traditionally said. He wrote that much about yin and yang. Because it's important to understand not only how the energy cycle works, but that yin and yang are the 2 feet by which any movement occurs. They're the essence of Te, happening. So that one has to understand that the 5-phase energy cycle, each phase probably has a yang and a yin quality to it. So that each correspondence, like the 5 elements, when they occur, there must be not only earth, but there must be a yang earth that starts it, and a yin earth, then a yang wood, and then a yin wood, then a yang metal, and then a yin metal. And it goes on in this way. So that instead of just the 5-phase energy cycle, one now has a 10 quality of like a jagged lightning that goes around in a circle. So out of this comes the 10 heavenly stems. So that Chinese correspondence in the development of its history gets completely absorbed at the very beginning of, say, the 3rd century BC. Began in the 4th, but by the 3rd century, it had dominated the Chinese mind so much that they began to not even think about Tao, but to try to figure out as human nature will. Everyone loves crossword puzzles. What are the yin and the yang of all the correspondences there are? Well, how many correspondences are there? Well, there are any number of them. Not only are there 5 elements, but there are 5 colors that go with these elements. The earth has yellow with it, and that must correspond then also to the dynastic happenings in Chinese history. So the earliest dynasty, the Shang, was identified with this sense that there must be some kind of a correspondence in the way that it happens. There were legendary kings before the Shah, so they would have then been the earth. So that the era of the legendary kings before the first dynasty correspond to the yellow earth element, encapsulated as the yellow emperor, Shang-Ti, Huang-Ti. And so the yellow emperor is characteristic of the pre-dynastic China, yellow and earth. The first dynasty, the Xia, then, would be characterized by wood, and the color would be green. The second dynasty would be the Shang dynasty, which was characterized by then the third element being metal, and the color was white. So when the Zhou dynasty came in, they're the 3rd dynasty, but it's the 4th in this phase, so they were corresponding to what? To fire, and the color was red. So when the Han dynasty displaced the Zhou, they said, we are the last word on earth of the way in which the real happens, and our nature must be the 5th element, water, and our color will be black. So when Chen Shi Huang Ti came into power, he made everyone wear black because that was it. That's our color. And you were put to death if you wore some other color. Because one of the correspondent characteristics of the fifth phase is that no more debate. This is it. So a kind of an inculcation of justified tyranny characterized the fifth phase. We are the last phase of the real. You're going to argue with us. All the arguments were made in previous phases. We have the solution now that is permanent and forever. And for you arguing against us means that you're a throwback. You're a regression. And we can't have regressions around here. And so you were killed. And so Ching Shi Huang Ti, figuring that he had the right, simply not only burned all the books, but killed all the competition. He built the Great Wall of China to show that this was the line of the real. This is what is real. This is what is power. We have everything in order. When the Han Dynasty fell, it was a shock to the whole Chinese system of what was just. And there wasn't another dynasty set up until the Tang, some 400 years later, because for 400 years there were competitors, there were many dynasties, so-called little dynasties, little kingdoms. It proliferated. At one point in the 3rd century, there must have been a dozen warlords saying, we're the next dynasty, because the next phase would come back to the pre-dynastic reign of the Yellow Emperor, back to the Tao, and who knows what that is. So when the Han Dynasty fell, it was like a Dark Ages, but it was a Dark Ages of ultimate confusion because no one understood the Tao. No one understood the zero-based first phase at all. No one understood it at all. One of the greatnesses of Tai Tsung is that he put an end to this kind of confusion by saying, my family goes back to Banzi. I'm of the Li families, and we're going to establish this dynasty now at this exact phase, and this is how it will happen. And when the Tang was established, it was like fresh air from the ancient past suddenly coming in, and the great golden age of China occurred. So what we're talking about here is not just polite philosophy. It's not just little nitpicking metaphysics. We're talking about the spinal column of the whole civilization of China. The arbiter of that is how you understand the Tao Te Ching. Yes, the I Ching is enormously important, but the I Ching is so vast that almost no one ever masters it. Confucius, in his old age, was reported to say, I wish I could live another 50 years so I could devote it to understand the I Ching. That even in his apex of wise old age, he knew it would take another half century just to understand the I Ching. But the Tao Te Ching can be picked up, literally, can be put into your hand, the 5-phase hand, the 5,000 characters, and somehow the temptation is there that it can be had. You can understand that. Except that it's mysterious. It's like the dragon. But we can understand it. We live almost in the 21st century. And we have plenty of time. And we have enough amplitude and enough depth. And we can use language with enough precision. But the Tao Te Ching if we're patient, and let it unfold in a certain structure of presentation, will occur for us. And when we have gone through this, it will be a gift that will be there for you for as long as you live. Let me come back here for just a second before we go. Let's come back to another great author, Joseph Needham. Joseph Needham, whose Science and Civilization in China, published by Cambridge University Press, is in many volumes now. I think it's going to run to about 20 volumes. And Joseph Needham was really quite somebody. He was one of those great Britishers during the 30s and 40s, cigar smoking, spoke Chinese perfectly, and spent about 45, 50 years researching and getting together a staff and really understanding, did China ever have any science? And of course, the science was very largely Taoist. The key science in China was alchemy. And the key that unlocks alchemy is the Tao Te Ching, not the I Ching. The I Ching, as it comes down to us, is the Zhou-I, the book of Zhou changes, from about 1100 BC. Alchemy comes up about 800 years later. It comes up because of the digestion of Guanzi. So the key to Chinese alchemy is the Tao Te Ching. Just like the key to understanding Western alchemy is to understand how the Egyptian Book of the Dead gets to be the Poimandres and some of the other Hermetic documents. The crater, the rebirth, all of the Corpus Hermeticum, how the Tibetan, the Egyptian Book of the Dead becomes those books. Needham gives us a translation of some of Su Yan's writings, and I'd like to just read you a couple of paragraphs from Su Yan's writings, if I can zero in. Here it is. What the Confucians call the Middle Kingdom, China, holds a place in the whole world but one part in 81. In other words, Su Yan, 350 BC, is saying the Confucians call China the Middle Kingdom, but China is only 1/81st of the whole world. And incidentally, that's about right in 20th century geographic terms. The land area of China is about 1/81st of the world. He goes on. And I want to skip over here so we can have time to get this in. Provisions for administration and education, recommendations of complicated rites and ceremonies, or alternately of simplicity in them. All are remedies suitable for particular ages. They may be practical and practicable during certain periods, but with the passage of time, they may have to be abandoned and revised. As circumstances change, so these things must change. Those who insist on adhering to particular arrangements and will not change with the times will never attain perfection in the art of ruling. Now this is pretty wide assault on the Confucian order 350 BC, which was just nascent there. He's saying that the rites and rituals, the ceremonies, the structures of the mind that you use to make things, have a time correspondence. And just as the energy cycle is constantly changing, so time also follows in this way. And if your rituals are out of sync with the actual time, what time is it in the universe anyway? They're never going to work. Disorder is going to happen. And so the Taoists, during the Han Dynasty, had to be very quiet, but they were very certain. the time is out of joint. This is going to pass. And so books like the Finance are time capsule encouragements that when this goes, go back to the Tao. And when the Han went, everyone went back to the Tao. There were thousands of Taoist socialist communities, communes where they shared everything. And of course, this was completely forbidden many times later in Chinese history. It was forbidden for anybody to talk about it until the 20th century. Now we're going to look at the Tao Te Ching next week and for the following 20 weeks. And I'm going to take 4 sections or 4 chapters at a time. And I'm going to try to just go through it in such a way as to elucidate what they are, but also bring in material like this so that you can get an appreciation. And all of this is relevant to us, to our time. And I'll bring enough material in so that you'll have an acquaintance with Chinese civilization. So when you finish, you'll be able to pick up the Tao Te Ching with 3 levels of ordinate awareness.